The weight of my past clung to me like an invisible shroud as I pulled up to the old secluded house. My heart was a tangled knot of nerves and anticipation, but I knew this fresh start was exactly what I needed. The divorce had taken its toll, and it was time for me to rediscover who I was. The house stood before me, a testament to the passage of time, its time-worn facade belying the hidden beauty within. As I walked through the creaky front door, a sense of unease washed over me. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to the lingering remnants of my past. I spent the first few days unpacking and organizing, trying to make the house feel like home. That's when I first noticed it, a shadow in the core of the living room that didn't seem to be cast by any visible source. I examined it from every angle, attempting to find a logical explanation, but it remained an enigma. At first, I dismissed the shadow as a trick of the light or a figment of my overactive imagination. But as the days went by, the feeling of unease intensified. I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was watching me, a silent witness to my every move. Sleep became elusive, my dreams invaded by whispers of darkness and the ever-present shadow. In the harsh light of day, I tried to ignore it, but it seemed to be growing bolder, as if it were slowly creeping closer. Finally, my curiosity got the better of me. I needed to know what the shadow was and why it haunted the corners of my new home. I decided to delve into the history of the house, hoping to find some answers to the mystery that had begun to consume my thoughts. I had no idea that my search for the truth would uncover secrets far darker than I could have ever imagined. It was at the local library that I stumbled upon the name Edward, a reclusive artist who had once owned the house. His life was shrouded in mystery, and his disappearance had left the town abuzz with whispered speculation. As I dug deeper into Edward's past, I couldn't help but feel it. The key to unraveling the enigma of the shadow in the corner lay hidden within the pages of his story. My investigation into Edward's life became an all-consuming obsession. I spent hours poring over newspaper clippings, old photographs, and any other pieces of information I could find. It was during one of my late-night research sessions that I stumbled upon a series of unsettling paintings Edward had left behind. Each painting depicted a haunting scene, but what struck me the most was the presence of a shadowy figure lurking in the background. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized that the figure bore an uncanny resemblance to the shadow in my living room. It was then that I knew I needed help. My search led me to John, a local historian who had researched Edward's life and art extensively. Together, we examined the paintings, trying to decipher the message hidden within the brushstrokes. Our conversations were filled with theories and conjecture, but we both knew that we were dancing around the undeniable truth. The shadow in the corner was more than just a trick of the light. As John and I delved deeper into Edward's past, we discovered a dark secret. The artist had been involved in the occult, making a pact with a malevolent entity in exchange for artistic inspiration. The thought sent a chill down my spine, and I couldn't help but wonder if that very same entity was now haunting my home. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, John and I decided to visit the places that had been significant in Edward's life. We started with his studio, a small dusty room filled with half-finished paintings and the lingering scent of turpentine. The air felt heavy, as if the room itself held the weight of Edward's secret. As we continued our investigation, it became clear that the shadowy figure was more than just a figment of Edward's imagination. Each location we visited seemed to hold a piece of the puzzle, and we were slowly but surely uncovering the truth behind the malevolent force that had once held Edward in its thrall. With each new piece of information, the shadow in the corner of my living room seemed to grow more restless, as if it sensed that its secret was on the verge of being revealed. The atmosphere in the house grew heavier, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I knew that I couldn't let this malevolent presence continue to control my life. It was time to confront the shadow in the corner and put an end to its reign of terror once and for all. But first, John and I needed to uncover the truth about Edward's pact and find a way to break the hold that the entity had around. As John and I continued to piece together the fragments of Edward's story, we came to understand the gravity of the situation. The malevolent entity that had once haunted Edward was now trying to latch onto me, seeking a new host to further its sinister agenda. Desperate for a solution, we enlisted the help of Marion, a psychic renowned for her abilities to sense and combat malevolent energies. Upon entering my home, she was immediately aware of the oppressive presence that lurked in the shadows. Marion confirmed our suspicions, explaining that the entity was attempting to strengthen its connection to me by drawing on my fears and vulnerabilities. It was then that I knew I needed to face my own demons in order to sever the link that tethered the entity to my life. With Marianne's guidance, John and I visited each location tied to the shadowy figure confronting the malevolent force that resided within. At each site we were met with resistance, a palpable pushback from the darkness that sought to maintain its grip on the trapped souls connected to the entity. As we delved deeper into the mystery, we discovered that the trapped souls were all connected to a series of unsolved cold cases. These spirits, unable to find peace in the afterlife, had become entangled in the entities their suffering, fueling its insatiable hunger for power. It became clear that in order to banish the entity and free the trapped souls, we would need to solve the cold cases and bring justice to those who had been wronged. With renewed determination, we threw ourselves into the task, meticulously gathering evidence and following leads that had long been forgotten. As we worked, I felt the shadow in the core growing more agitated, its desperation manifesting in a series of terrifying encounters that tested my resolve. But with each confrontation, I grew stronger, the bonds that had once tethered me to the darkness slowly starting to unravel. Our quest for justice was arduous, but with each cold case we solved, the trapped souls found peace and were released from the entity's grip. The malevolent force, sensing its power wanting, became increasingly desperate in its attempts to maintain its hold on my life. As we closed in on the final case, the entity's influence over the house reached a fever pitch. Objects flew across rooms, doors slammed shut, and the once persistent Chow seemed to grow larger, threatening to engulf the entire living room. But with Marianne's guidance, I stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated by the darkness that had invaded my home. Finally, we uncovered the truth behind the last cold case, a young woman wrongfully accused of a crime she did not commit. Her spirit, trapped in limbo and tormented by the injustice she had suffered, had been the perfect target for the malevolent entity. With the evidence we had gathered, John and Anna were able to clear her name, allowing her spirit to find the peace she so desperately deserved. As her soul was released, a palpable shift occurred in the atmosphere of my home. The oppressive darkness that had once threatened to suffocate me began to recede, pushed back by the light that now filled the space. The shadow in the corner, now weakened and diminished, was no longer able to maintain its hold on my life. I felt the last remnants of its power slip away, its presence in my home reduced to nothing more than a distant memory. With a malevolent entity banished and the trapped souls set free, my house was finally purged of the darkness that had once threatened to consume me. I could finally begin my new life, unburdened by the shadow in the corner and the weight of my past. Through our shared journey, John, Marion, and I had forged an unbreakable bond. We had faced the darkness together, and in the process, had discovered a strength within ourselves that we never knew we possessed. My name is John Wilson, and my family and I have been searching for the perfect place to escape the chaotic city life. We finally found it in a secluded ranch in rural Utah. It was far away from the hustle and bustle, and we couldn't have been more excited to start our new life. The ranch was nestled among rolling hills with a small creek meandering through the property. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sagebrush and wildflowers. I couldn't help but marvel at the stunning landscape that surrounded us. My wife, Sarah, and our 2 children, Emily and Noah, shared in my excitement as we explored our new home. as we settled into our daily routine, we began to notice peculiar occurrences around the property. One morning, while checking the fence line, I discovered strange animal tracks that seemed to come out of nowhere and lead to the edge of the woods. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the tracks seemed to change shape as they went along, as if the creature was shifting from one form to another. I tried to shake off the eerie feeling it gave me. Another night, Sarah and I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the night. We heard an odd, unnerving howl that seemed to echo from every direction. The children claimed they heard whispers outside their windows, but when we investigated, we found nothing amiss. One weekend, Sarah and I decided that we should make more of an effort to connect with our neighbors. We figured that getting to know them would not only help us feel more at home in our new community, but might also shed some light on the strange occurrences we've been experiencing. We planned a casual potluck dinner at our ranch and invited the closest families. We spent the day preparing the house, setting up tables and chairs outside, and cooking some of our favorite dishes. Sarah's homemade chili was always a hit, and I took pride in my barbecue skills. As our guests arrived, we greeted each of them warmly, eager to learn more about them in the area. The neighbors seemed genuinely pleased to be included, and they brought with them from homemade pies to wild game casseroles. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over our gathering, conversations flowed easily. We learned about the nearby families, their histories in the area, and the challenges and rewards of living in such a remote location. It wasn't until the fire pit was crackling and the stars began to make their appearance that the conversation turned to the ranch of the mysterious past. A sense of unease seemed to settle over the group as they began sharing hush stories of unexplained events and eerie sightings. An older gentleman named Hank, who lived a few miles down the road, shared his own encounter with a strange, shape-shifting creature that had terrorized his livestock. Another neighbor, Susan, spoke of eerie whispers and shadowy figures that seemed to lurk in the surrounding woods. The more we listened to these stories, the more we realized that our own experiences were not unique. As the evening wore on, the tales of the ranch's history and the legend of the skinwalkers began to intertwine. It was clear that there was something more to the ranch than we initially understood. Our curiosity only grew stronger. Despite our skepticism, we couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease that settled over us as the fire burned down to glowing embers. We thanked our guests for joining us and bid them good night. But as we lay in bed that night, Sarah and I couldn't help but wonder if there was some truth to the stories that had been shared. As the days passed, our curiosity about the ranch and its history only grew stronger. Sarah and I spent hours researching the legend of the skinwalkers and the Native American tribes that once inhabited the area. Meanwhile, the strange occurrences on our property continued to escalate, becoming more terrifying and harder to ignore. One evening, Emily burst into the house, her eyes wide with fear. She claimed she'd seen a massive, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes lurking near the edge of the woods while playing with Noah. Although we tried to reassure her that it was likely just her imagination, Sarah and I couldn't shake the feeling that our children were in danger. Determined to find answers, we reached out to a local historian, Dr. Elaine Morgan, and a Native American shaman named Gray Owl. Both were well versed in the area's history and legends, and we hoped they could shed some light on our situation. Dr. Morgan visited our ranch, her eyes widening as we showed her the Native American artifacts we'd discovered. She explained that the items were sacred to the ancient tribes that once lived on the land, and that they were believed to have a deep spiritual connection to the skinwalkers. According to Dr. Morgan, our ranch was built on land that was once considered sacred, a place where the veil between the physical and spiritual worlds was thin. Gray Owl, a tall, stoic man with a wealth of knowledge about his culture's beliefs and customs, confirmed Dr. Morgan's findings. He told us that the skinwalkers were powerful supernatural beings, hit and blow of shape-shifting and causing harm to those who trespassed on their territory. He believed that the curse on our ranch was real and that our family was in danger. Sura and I were stunned by these revelations, unsure of how to protect our children and ourselves from these malevolent creatures. Grey Owl offered to help us, explaining that there was a ritual that could be performed to appease the spirits and lift the curse from our land. However, he warned that the ritual would be dangerous and that we would need to confront the skinwalkers directly. With trepidation, we agreed to perform the ritual. We had no choice. The safety of our family was at stake. Grey Owl and Dr. Morgan guided us through the process, teaching us the ancient chants and gathering the necessary items to create a protective circle around their home. As the day of the ritual approached, the air seemed to grow heavier, and the atmosphere around the ranch became more oppressive. We knew that we were about to face a battle unlike anything we'd ever experienced, and we steeled ourselves for what was to come. The day of the ritual finally arrived, and the air was heavy with tension and anticipation. Sarah and I gathered our children close, reassuring them that everything would be okay. We could see the fear in their eyes, but we tried our best to put on brave faces. Grey Owl and Dr. Morgan arrived at our ranch as the sun began to dip below the horizon. They carried bundles of sage and sweetgrass, along with an assortment of other ritual items. Together, we prepared the space where we would perform the ceremony, creating a protective circle with sacred stones and symbols. As night fell and the first stars appeared, we began the ritual. Grey Owl led us in chanting ancient incantations, his deep voice echoing through the still air. The scent of burning sage and sweetgrass filled the air, creating a calming atmosphere that belied the tension we all felt. As the ritual progressed, we became acutely aware of the unseen forces that surrounded us. The air seemed to crackle with energy, and the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the distant howls of creatures we couldn't see. Our hearts pounded in our chests, and we gripped each other's hands tightly, drawing strength from one another. Suddenly the skinwalkers appeared, their forms shifting and twisting before our very eyes. They were horrifying to behold, with grotesque features and an overwhelming sense of malevolence. Fear coursed through our veins, but we knew we couldn't back down now. Grey Owl shouted instructions to us, guiding us through the ritual as we faced the skinwalkers head-on. We held our ground, chanting the incantations with all the strength and conviction we could muster. The skinwalkers snarled and lunged at us, but the protective circle held them at bay, the sacred symbols glowing with a fierce, ethereal light. The battle raged on, and we fought with everything we had. The skinwalkers grew more desperate, their forms twisting and contorting in a horrifying display of supernatural power. But we remained steadfast, determined to protect our family and our home. Finally, as the ritual reached its peak, the curse began to lift. The skinwalkers let out an agonized howl, their forms disintegrating before our very eyes. They retreated into the darkness, leaving behind a palpable sense of relief that washed over us. The crisp morning air filled my lungs as I set out on my hiking trip, eager to escape the stress of daily life. The sun had barely risen above the horizon, casting long shadows on the ground as I walked along the well-trodden trail. I marveled at the sight of dew-covered leaves glistening under the soft rays of sunlight, and the serene melody of birdsong welcomed me deeper into the woods. After a couple of hours, I came across a hidden, overgrown path that seemed to veer off the main trail. It appeared to have been long forgotten, with overhanging branches and thorny vines obstructing its entrance. Curiosity piqued, I decided to follow this mysterious path, feeling the thrill of discovery rush through my veins. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the foliage grew denser and the shadows seemed to close in around me. The sense of isolation intensified with each step, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the untouched beauty of this hidden trail. Eventually, I stumbled upon a long-lost campsite, now little more than a clearing surrounded by a thick underbrush. It was clear that it hadn't been used in years, possibly even decades. In the center of the clearing lay an abandoned backpack, its fabric faded and mourned by time. Intrigued, I cautiously approached it, my heart pounding in my chest. I knelt down and carefully opened the backpack, revealing its contents. A rusted canteen, a moldy sleeping bag. In a weathered journal, its pages yellowed and tattered. The journal seemed to be the most interesting item, so I picked it up and flipped to the first page, discovering that it belonged to a man named Thomas. As I began to read it, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The journal detailed Thomas's solo hiking trip, much like my own, and his discovery of his very campsite. It seemed that he, too, had been lured off the main trail by the enigmatic path that led to this clearing. I continued to read, feeling a growing sense of trepidation. The further I delved into Thomas's journal, the more I began to realize that his story was far from ordinary. There was something strange, something terrible hidden in these woods, and it seemed that Thomas had been unfortunate enough to discover it. My hands trembled slightly as I continued to read Thomas's journal, turning to the first entry dated June 4th, 1963. His handwriting was neat and precise, despite the age of the journal. I took a deep breath and began to read, hoping to uncover more about Thomas and his ominous discovery. Thomas wrote of his excitement and anticipation for his solo hiking trip, much like my own journey. He described the feeling of freedom and solitude that enveloped him as he ventured deeper into the woods. The words on the page painted a vivid picture of his surroundings: towering trees reaching for the sky, the earthy smell of damp soil, and the gentle rustle of leaves as a soft breeze swept through the forest. As I read on, I discovered that Thomas, too, had stumbled upon the hidden, overgrown trail that led him to the beautiful, seemingly untouched clearing where I now sat. He described the clearing in detail, mentioning the way sunlight dappled through the leaves, casting a warm glow on the forest floor. The serene beauty of the place had captivated him, and he decided to set up camp for the night. However, as darkness fell, Thomas's account took a more sinister turn. He wrote of strange noises outside his tent that sounded like whispers, barely audible but unmistakable in the stillness of the night. He recounted the sensation of goosebumps rising on his skin and of hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, his heart palming in his chest as he strained to make out the source of the eerie whispers. Despite his unease, Thomas decided to stay in his tent, telling himself that the sounds were merely the wind playing tricks on his mind. He tried to focus on the soothing rhythm of the crickets and the gentle rustle of leaves, but the unsettling whispers seemed to grow louder, gnawing at the edges of his consciousness. Thomas wrote of the overwhelming feeling that he was being watched, that there was something out there in the darkness, just beyond the thin walls of his tent. He struggled to fall asleep, his mind racing with thoughts on the unknown lurking in the shadows. As I finished reading the entry, my heart raced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was sharing Thomas's experience. I glanced around the clearing nervously, acutely aware of the darkness that was beginning to settle around me. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers brushing the edge of the next page. I steeled myself and continued reading, compelled by Thomas's story and the chilling events that had unfolded in the very clearing where I now sat. The entry began with Thomas recounting his confusion upon waking up the following morning. The once beautiful clearing had transformed overnight, now overgrown and eerie, as if nature itself was conspiring against him. He described the gnarled branches that twisted menacingly above him and the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to weigh heavily on his chest. Determined to escape the unsettling clearing, Thomas tried to retrace his steps and fight his way back to the main trail. However, he soon realized that his map and compass were no longer reliable, as if the very landscape had shifted around him. He wrote of his growing disorientation and the creeping sense of dread that accompanied each step he took further away from the safety of the familiar trail. As Thomas wandered through the disorienting woods, he stumbled upon a cave hidden by tangled vines and overgrown foliage. The mouth of the cave was adorned with strange, ancient symbols that seemed to draw him in, despite the foreboding darkness that lay within. Unable to resist the inexplicable pull, Thomas ventured inside. The air inside the cave was damp and cool. The echo of each footstep, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that filled the space. Covered in luminescent moss and more of the mysterious symbols that seemed to dance in the dim light. As he ventured deeper into the cave, he began to hear the whispers again, the same eerie sounds that had haunted him the previous night. His heart palming in his chest, Thomas rounded a corner and came face to face with a terrifying otherworldly creature. The thing was a grotesque amalgamation of shadows and malice, its very presence an affront to the natural world. It was the source of the whispers that voiced a sinister chorus that seemed to reverberate inside his skull. As I read Thomas's account of the encounter, I could feel my pulse quicken, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The terror he experienced was palpable on the page, and I couldn't help but glance around the clearing nervously, suddenly aware of every rustle and creak in the surrounding woods. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves as I turned to the final entry in Thomas's. The pages seemed to whisper softly as they turned, echoing the sinister chorus that haunted Thomas's story. The entry began with Thomas recounting his narrow escape from the cave, fueled by adrenaline and sheer terror. He described the heart-stopping race through the dark, winding passages, the whispers of the creature growing louder and more insistent with every step. The final burst of speed, Thomas managed to break free of the cave's suffocating embrace, stumbling into the sunlight. Now convinced that the creature had cursed him, Thomas wrote of his growing despair as he continued to wander the woods, unable to find his way back to civilization. He believed that the creature's malevolent influence had infected him, causing his disorientation and the unsettling transformation of his surroundings. With each step, Thomas felt as if he was being led further away from salvation, deeper into the inescapable clutches of the creature's domain. Thomas made the fateful decision to confront the creature once more, convinced that it was the only way to free himself from its crest. He described his resolve, his determination to face the horrifying entity that had haunted him since he first set foot in the now Almas clearing. The journal entry ended abruptly, the last few words trailing off into nothingness, leaving Thomas's fate uncertain. I stared at the final page, the weight of Thomas's story settling heavily on my chest. The terrible secret he had uncovered in these woods now felt like an oppressive shadow, a sinister presence that refused to be ignored. Feeling the urgent need to leave, I hastily packed up my belongings and set off, desperate to escape the woods and a terrifying secret hidden within. My heart pounded in my chest as I retraced my steps. The once peaceful forest now filled with menacing shadows and whispered threats. After what felt like an eternity, I finally emerged from the woods, the relief of returning to civilization washing over me. Unable to shake the haunting tale of Thomas and the terrible secret he had discovered, I researched his story and found that he was never found, his disappearance shrouded in mystery. I woke up feeling a little disoriented, as if I had been rudely torn from a dream. The sunlight streaming in through my bedroom window seemed oddly bright, but I chalked it up to a restless night. As I stumbled towards the bathroom, the floor felt colder than usual, like a sheet of ice. I told myself it was just another strange quirk of the day and maybe I should get a rug for the bathroom. Throughout the day, things just didn't feel right. My coffee tasted more bitter than usual, and the newspaper headlines seemed disjointed, like a jumble of words thrown together. I tried to shake it off, lay me on a lack of sleep, but the feeling persisted. At work, I noticed that my colleagues' conversation sounded distant, and the words seemed to lose their meaning as soon as they were spoken. The once familiar office space now felt foreign and detached. As if I was an observer in someone else's life, I could no longer find comfort in my daily routine. As the day wore on, I noticed more and more things that seemed different. My favorite park, which I walked through every day on my way home, had trees I didn't recognize, and a statue that was missing an arm. The faces of the people passing by were unfamiliar, and their expressions were vacant. The world around me felt like a hazy imitation of the life I had known. For months, I felt a growing sense of unease. It started subtly with the smallest of changes. The aroma of my morning coffee, once comforting and invigorating, began to fade, replaced by a lingering bitterness. I attributed it to a change in the brand or a new batch of beans, but something in the back of my mind kept nagging me that there was more to it. Gradually, the peculiarities intensified. I found that the music on the radio didn't sound the same, as if the familiar melodies had been altered or the lyrics shifted just enough to be unfamiliar. The paintings and photographs on my walls seemed to change too. Their colors appeared duller, and the images they captured appeared ever so slightly off. I brushed it off as my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling of unease persisted. Over time, the days grew stranger still. The streets of my hometown, which I had navigated effortlessly for years, began to betray me. I would find myself lost on familiar routes, as if the layout of the roads had been inexplicably altered. Buildings I knew so well seemed to disappear, only to re-emerge days or weeks later in the same spot, as though they had never been gone. The weather patterns, too, were puzzling. The sun would rise and set at odd angles, and the night sky seemed to be missing stars I had gazed at my entire life. The wind carried strange scents, and the air felt thick and heavy, as if it were a tangible presence weighing me down. Over the months, these small oddities began to affect my relationships. Conversations with friends and family became disorienting, as they would recall events differently from how I remembered them. Their laughter sounded hollow, and their expressions seemed muted, as if they were actors in a play rather than the loved ones I'd known for so long. I began to wonder if I was suffering from some kind of mental breakdown. I sought solace in books and articles, trying to understand what was happening to me. Despite my efforts, the unsettling changes continued to accumulate like snowflakes piling up on a cold winter's day, until my world was almost unrecognizable. I tried to adapt to find some semblance of normalcy in this shifting landscape of my life. I searched for answers, for a way to make sense of the strange, altered reality in which I found myself. But every day, it seemed like the world around me slipped further and further away from the one I used to know. It was on a chilly, overcast morning that I found the first note. The paper was slightly damp from the morning dew, and the ink had blood, making the words appear as if they were trembling. "Wake up! Your family is waiting for you." The words resonated within me, leaving me feeling cold and uneasy, and glanced around looking for any indication of who could have left the note, but the street was empty, devoid of any signs of life. I tried to dismiss it as a prank, but the note nodded me, its message echoing in my mind. Days passed, and I found another note taped to my door. The words were hastily scrawled, as if the writer was desperate for me to understand. "Please wake up. Something isn't right." The feeling of dread in the pit of my stomach grew, and I couldn't shake the sensation that these messages were meant for me. As the weeks went by, the notes appeared with increasing frequency, and their urgency intensified. They began to arrive every few days, each one more desperate than the last. "You'll belong here," one read. "This world isn't real," said another. The messages became more frantic, the handwriting more erratic, as if the person writing them was a child. Soon the notes were appearing daily, the paper often crumpled, and the ink smeared. "Your family needs you," one implored. "Remember who you are," begged another. With each note, the weight of their message bore down on me, making it harder to dismiss them as mere pranks or the work of a disturbed individual. The final note arrived on a stormy night, the rain pounding against my window as if it were trying to break through. The words were written in bold, angry strokes. "Wake up! Your famile away is waiting." It was as if the writer was screaming at me, desperate to make me understand the truth that I had been so reluctant to accept. I could no longer ignore the messages. The notes had become a haunting chorus, a constant reminder of the growing sense of unease that had taken root in my life. The urgency in each message compelled me to search for answers, to find a way to decipher the cryptic warnings and uncover the truth they were trying to convey. Determined to unravel the mystery behind the messages, I began to devote every spare moment to the investigation. I started by confessing my neighborhood, asking my neighbors if they had seen anything suspicious or received similar notes. While some expressed concern, none had experienced anything like the eerie messages that were plaguing me. Unsatisfied with the lack of progress, I decided to invest in a security camera to secretly position it to monitor my front door. Each morning I would review the footage, hoping to catch a glimpse of the note lever in action. The notes continued to appear, but whoever was leading them remained elusive, like a ghost slipping through the shadows. As my search for the truth intensified, I turned to unconventional methods. I consulted with private investigators, mediums, and even a local folklore expert, hoping to glean some insight into the mysterious messages. Each new lead and theory was ultimately a dead end, leaving me feeling more lost and desperate than before. I spent hours in the library and online, scouring articles on psychology, paranormal phenomena, and even alternate realities, searching for any clues that might help me understand what was happening. My investigation led me down many strange paths, from conspiracy theories to tales of supernatural intervention, but no answers were forthcoming. The notes had become an obsession, their urgency driving me into the brink of madness. I started to question my own sanity, wondering if I was creating the messages myself, perhaps during bouts of sleepwalking or some other fugue state. Desperate for answers, I sought out professional help, attending sessions with therapists and psychologists, but their words provided little solace, and the mystery remained unsolved. Each new message fueled my determination to find the person behind them, to understand the meaning of their cryptic words, and uncover the hidden truth that seemed just out of reach. As the messages grew more desperate and the weight of their warnings bore down on me, I became consumed by the search, losing myself in the endless pursuit of an answer that always seemed to be just beyond my grasp. My obsession with the notes led me down a path of constant anxiety and restlessness, my mind racing with possibilities and theories. I had become a shadow of my former self, the mystery consuming my every thought. One evening, as I returned home after yet another fruitless day of investigation, I was barely aware of my surroundings, my mind preoccupied with the haunting messages. As I climbed the steps to my apartment, the exhaustion and the emotional turmoil that had been building up inside me finally took their toll. My foot caught on a raised edge, and I stumbled, the world around me suddenly lurching into chaos. Unable to catch myself, I hurled forward, my head colliding with the unforgiving concrete. The pain was sharp and immediate, a searing heat that tore through my skull like a bolt of lightning. And then, in an instant, everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I found myself lying in a sterile white hospital room. The steady beep of monitors filled the air, and the scent of antiseptics stung my nostrils. My body felt heavy and unresponsive, as though I was weighed down by a leading blanket. I struggled to make sense of my surroundings by my defaunt of confusion. My family was gathered around me, their faces etched with relief and love. As they noticed me stirring, their eyes filled with tears of joy. A mother's voice trembled as she whispered, "We thought we lost you. You'd get in a coma for months after a terrible car crash. We didn't know if you'd ever wake up." Their words sent a wave of shock through me. Months lost, trapped within my own mind, living a life that wasn't real. The strange occurrences, the unsettling changes, the cryptic messages, all of it was a manifestation of my unconscious mind, struggling to break free from the prison of my coma. As the truth began to sink in, the memories of the life I left behind started to return. I realized that my journey was far from over. I now faced a long road to recovery, both physically and emotionally. But as I lay there surrounded by love and support of my family, I knew that I was ready to face the challenges ahead and to rebuild the life I had lost. The first time I saw Brett, I was 19. I'd found a job working security at Dave's storage unit. My duties included keeping vagrants and thieves from disturbing the 40 rental units that were laid out in 5 neat rows in the middle of downtown Atlanta and helping customers with lost combinations for their locks. It wasn't the safest part of town to be working a night shift, but it seemed to be easy work, and the hours meshed nicely with my class schedule at the community college. I trained 2 shifts on days, and then showed up that Thursday at 10 p.m. for my first shift alone. Or so I thought. I arrived 10 minutes early. A guy in a Fall Out Boy t-shirt sat at one desk playing solitaire, and a girl with long blonde hair had her feet propped on the other, with a ball cap pulled down covering her face. "Hi," I said when he looked up. "I'm Jason, new guy." "I'm Tom," he said, and started shoving stuff into a backpack. "Quiet day so far. Good luck. The crazies come out at night." The girl lowered her hat and stared at me. She was the kind of beautiful that just stops a guy in his tracks. Big green eyes, full lips, flawless skin. I realized I was staring and mumbled a hi in her direction. Her eyes widened and she tipped her head in greeting. Tom looked up at me, eyebrows raised. "Yeah, so all the keys are in the top drawer of that filing cabinet, along with a master list of the combination locks. Don't give anyone access unless they show 2 forms of ID, and you make a copy of it. They'll fire your ass if you're not a stickler about that. And it has to be the person with their name on the contract, not a girlfriend, not a wifey. Some guy almost got canned because he let a wife in and she left with his whole stamp collection in the middle of a divorce." "It was him," the girl said, and pointed at Tom. He ignored her, already heading toward the door. "See ya, wouldn't want to be ya," he said. "Night shift sucks." The girl flipped him a bird and I laughed. Tom shot me a look I couldn't decipher, but then he gave a half-hearted wave and shut the door behind him. I looked at the row of monitors and then back at the girl. She hadn't taken her eyes off me and I felt awkward and flushed under her gaze. "I'm Jason," I said again, and immediately felt like an idiot. "Brett," she said, and leaned back in the chair. "Nice to have someone to talk to in this joint." "What about Tom?" I asked, sitting in the seat he'd vacated. She shook her head. "He's a tool." "So, are you second shift or third? I thought I was working alone." She shrugged. "Wherever they need me." I guess they called her in to keep an eye on the new guy, and she didn't want to say she was supposed to babysit me. It was funny, because she seemed standoffish at first, but she was a talker, and I loved to listen to her. By 4 a.m. it felt like I'd known her forever, just one of those instant clicks, and maybe even more so by the types of conversation people tend to have at those hours. We talked everything from childhood to politics. I think I was already falling a little in love with her. She saw me stretch and said, "You want to go outside? We can do a walk around." A cool breeze blew, but she didn't seem to notice. I couldn't stop sneaking glances at her as we walked. Faded jeans, scuffed boots, black t-shirt, and a camo jacket. I probably had close to the same outfit in my closet, but on her, even the ordinary seemed beautiful. We walked the length of the first row and started down the second, when she stopped and touched a bright yellow dandelion sprouting up through a crack in the sidewalk with the toe of her boot. "Those are my favorite flowers," I laughed. "Those are weeds," she smiled. "Those aren't weeds, they're wishes. Haven't you ever blown on one and made a wish? And even when they're yellow, that's my favorite color. They're such happy, hopeful little things." That made me smile too. I'd never thought of them in that way. So many girls I knew seemed hung up on materialistic things, and Brett could find beauty in even this small flower. I was captivated. When we made it to the fourth row, she stopped. Her face pinched into a grim expression as she said, "I don't walk down this row." "Why?" I asked, taken aback by the look in her eyes. "Number 27. It gives me the creeps." It was the third bay door, and it looked exactly like the first two. I didn't understand, but I wanted her to smile again. Then we skipped this row. We finished walking the last row. A drink machine stood at the end of it, and I asked her if she wanted one. She shook her head as I fed quarters into the slot. A payphone I hadn't noticed rang shrilly, making me jump. I laughed at myself and glanced at her. Brett's expression wiped away my smile. She looked terrified. "Don't answer it!" she shouted. "Don't ever answer it!" I gaped at her, not understanding. I won't, what's wrong?" She didn't answer. She started walking briskly back toward the office. I chased after her, my change and soft drink forgotten. "That phone rings every morning at 4:17, she said as I opened the door for her. "When you answer, it sounds like dead air, or there's some sort of hissing noise. It gives me the creeps. Probably some automated thing. Wrong number or something, but it's set on an auto program." She looked at me and said, "Do you believe in ghosts, Jason? You think a ghost is calling?" "Don't make fun of me," she snapped. "I'm sorry." I held up my hands in a gesture of surrender. "Do I believe in ghosts? Well, I haven't ever seen one." She made a scoffing noise and I said, "But I won't rule them out. My grandmother believed in ghosts. She said she had the sight and swore that some people in our family could see them. Some had the gift of precognition, too. She was a very smart, reasonable lady." Mollified, Brett sat at the desk. "So, do you think everyone becomes a ghost when they die? Or do some move on to someplace else? Why would people be stuck here?" I shrugged. "Unfinished business? Violent death? I don't know. What do you think?" She took a moment before responding. "Maybe the unfinished business. Maybe there just is nothing else." The easy vibe of our earlier conversation disappeared. She seemed anxious, stressed. No matter what I tried to talk about, she seemed distracted. When Abe, the old guy on first shift, appeared to relieve us, she walked out the door without saying goodbye. I bid a hasty good morning to him and ran to catch up. I almost lost her, but I spied her head as she got on the train. It had been a long time since I had a MARTA pass, so I had to dig for the $2.50 fare. She frowned when I sat next to her in the back, and I realized I probably looked like creepy stalker guy. Too late now, but I didn't want her to be upset with me. I really liked this girl. "What are you doing?" she asked, and I wanted to run, but the train lurched forward. "I feel like I upset you, and I'm sorry." She looked at an elderly lady in the next row who was staring at us. Brett shook her head like it was okay, but the lady got up and moved toward the front. "It's not you," Brett said, "but I don't want to talk about it." "Let's talk about dandelions, then," I said. "They're my new favorite flower. Like you, pretty and magical." As corny as that was, she laughed, and our conversation slipped back into the same easiness it had before that payphone rang last night. At least, until the next stop. A lumbering bald man with beady dark eyes got on and took a seat a couple of rows in front of us. I saw Brett stiffen, though he didn't pay much attention to us at all. His gaze fixed on a pretty Latina who sat in the middle, playing on her smartphone. The rest of the ride, Brett never took her eyes off the man. He wasn't pleasant to look at, but I didn't understand her terror. "This is my stop," she said, and stood. The dark-haired girl also stood. "Brett," I said. Where are we?" "I need to get back to my motorcycle." She laughed then, the tension evaporating from her face. "You crazy boy. It will circle back around in about 6 more stops. I'll see you tonight." She waved and walked forward, giving the man a wide berth. For a moment, he looked like he was about to get behind them, and I was prepared to do so as well, so she'd feel safe. But he just sat there. Brett was already there when I arrived that night. She laughed when she saw the small bouquet of dandelions in my hand. Tom's eyebrows shot up. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He left in record time. "I don't think that guy likes me," I said. She waved her hand dismissively as I put the dandelions in water. "He doesn't like anyone. And thank you for the flowers. They're lovely." So are you, I thought. but I didn't have the courage to say it yet. I wasn't about to bring up the guy on the train. I hated that tense, scared look she'd worn this morning, but to my surprise, she did. "That man is evil," she said. "Please don't ask me to explain how I know. I'm afraid he means to hurt that girl, and I don't know how to stop him." My stomach dropped. "Brett, did he hurt you? We need to call the cops." She hesitated long enough to make me think he had, but she said, "No, I don't know. I can't remember things, and I'm scared to remember things. The phone makes me think of something, but I push it back. Anyway, it's not about me now. It's about that girl." She took a deep breath. "Let's talk about it later. I don't want to think about it right now." "I looked up dandelions between classes today," I said. "People in the 1800s used to blow on them after they went to seed. If all the seeds blew away, the object of your affection shared your feelings." I shook my head and gave her a pointed look. "You may not know it yet, but I think you're in love with me." She laughed long and hard, and I grinned, pleased to see her happy again. Then her face got sad. "I wish I'd met you before, Jason." "What's wrong with now?" I asked, with uncharacteristic bravery. "You're not married, are you?" She shook her head. "No, but I'm not what you think I am. There are a lot of bad things, Jason. I don't want to explain because I really like you. You're a beautiful girl with a weird taste in flowers. Think of all the money I'd save on Valentine's Day if you were my girlfriend." She laughed again. "Just keep talking to me. I hardly talk to anyone anymore, and you're so funny. Tell me about the motorcycle. I'm glad you made it back to it." "I actually didn't come back to it this morning," I admitted with a laugh. "I got off the train and took an Uber to my place, then hitched a ride to school, took the train back to work tonight. I was kinda hoping I'd see you." I had seen the creepy guy, but I didn't tell her that. "Come outside and I'll show it to you." She walked around it, trailing her fingers on the gleaming blue paint. "It's pretty," she said, "but I don't like these things. They'll get you killed." I was hoping I could take you on a ride on it sometime. She gave me a glance that looked like a definite no, but said, "We'll see." Everything was fine until the phone began to ring at 4:17 a.m. I watched her face get that same terrified look and wondered what in the world had happened to her, and if it connected somehow to the creepy guy. Around time for the day shift guy to come on, she mentioned the guy on the train again. I don't know why, but I have the feeling he's going to do something to her soon. I hate to ask because I know you need sleep and go to class, but would you ride the train with me again? "Of course," I said. Abe appeared at 6 on the dot. "Good morning, sunshine," he said, dropping his backpack onto a chair. "Good morning, Abe," Brett said. To me, she said, "I love that old guy." I chatted with him for a moment. Brett moved to the door and I said goodbye to Abe, intent on following her, when he called out, "Hey!" His old face was pale when I glanced back. He pointed a shaky finger at the styrofoam cup filled with dandelions. Where did these come from? The look on his face spooked me. I wasn't sure what was happening. I picked them for Brett. The old man's face went slack with shock. "You know Brett? You've seen her?" "What?" I whirled to look at her. She held out her hands in supplication. Tears streamed down her face. For the first time, I noticed she had on the same outfit as she had yesterday. "I'm sorry, Jason. I didn't know what to say." "Jason?" Abe asked louder. I said, "Have you seen Brett?" I couldn't tear my gaze from her. "Apparently your grandma wasn't the only one who had the gift," she said, and walked through the door. When I say walked through the door, I mean right through it. A freaking solid metal closed door. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Finally, I half fell onto one of the chairs. I heard Abe talking, but it was like he was speaking through a tunnel. It seemed like forever before I could focus on him. There was nothing I could say that wouldn't sound insane, so I didn't bother to sugarcoat. I said, "You didn't see her just now when you came in here?" He shook his head, his roomy eyes huge. I told him about working with her, about some of the things she'd said, even about the weird ringing phone. When I finished, he just stared at me. "To be honest, I don't know whether to believe you right now or to call the cops," he said. I nodded. It was a fair statement. I don't know what I'd think in his shoes. She said you used to be a cop before your wife got sick. I looked up at him. She said you're the reason she loves dandelions. You told her about how your wife loved them and how you decorated her hospital room with them before she died. Brett said it was the most romantic thing she'd ever heard. Abe sat heavily in the chair. I did tell her that. Can I ask you to describe her for me? I did, down to her scuffed boots, and he nodded. Then he reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a picture of her. It was Brett, all right, but on a missing poster. The clothing described as the last outfit she was seen wearing was what I'd seen her in. She went missing from her shift here 6 months ago. I showed up and this place was wide open. There was a great deal of blood out by that payphone. The police never had any leads. I gestured at the row of monitors. One showed the drink machine and phone. What about the cameras? Installed after the fact, because of her. Too little, too damn late. He leaned forward, giving me a hard stare. I loved that little girl. She was like a daughter to me. I've brought her dandelions myself. I've never believed in ghosts, but I saw your face this morning. I believe that you saw her, or you're some kind of nut and think you saw her. But I don't know how you know some of the things you know if that were the case. Brett and I worked together some, before we lost personnel and she got bumped to nights. I think she would have mentioned you, and I only told her the dandelion story right before she went missing. You could be the nut who took her, but I don't think so. I can't imagine why she'd share something like that with a person who would hurt her. If you see her again, ask her how much a mail-order bride costs. What? I felt like I'd fallen back down the rabbit hole again. Nothing made sense. I wondered if I was dreaming. Just do it, Abe said. Now go home. You look like shit. Only when I stumbled to the parking lot did I remember my promise to ride the train with her. I thought about Brett and the Latina girl. In fact, I skipped class and lay in my bed and thought about them all day. When I got to work that night, Tom was the only one there. Even though I still felt punch-drunk and scared, I had hoped Brett would be sitting there. Abe apparently hadn't told Tom about any of it, because he treated me with the same dismissiveness as always. It was weird to look back and realize he and Brett had never really spoken or interacted at all. I hadn't had a clue. By 4 a.m. I was getting a little stir-crazy, so I jumped up to walk around the storage buildings. I turned the corner of the last one and walked straight through Brett. I screamed like a little girl. She giggled a little and clamped her hand over her mouth. "I'm sorry. Jason, are you real?" I demanded. "Am I crazy?" "I think I'm real," she said. "At least I was. I know it sounds like I'm lying, but I don't remember much." She nodded at the payphone. "I remember this phone and it ringing. I think he used that to catch me off guard. I answered it and he hit me with something. I think..." She pinched the bridge of her nose. "I think he's about to kill that girl on the train. Maybe I'm supposed to help her." Abruptly, she swung her fist at my arm and it passed right through. I yelped, "Stop doing that!" Despite everything, she laughed. "I was just checking. I don't know how I'm supposed to stop him when he can't see me and I can't touch him." She winked. "On the bright side, I bet you look crazy as hell on the security cameras right now." I scowled at her, then something occurred to me. I glanced at my phone. 4:20 a.m. "Hey, the phone didn't ring?" She shot at a scared look. "What does that mean? Are we on the right track or are we running out of time?" I had no answer. The next morning when Abe came in, he gave me a wary look and said, "Is she here now?" I nodded and pointed at the chair she was sitting on. "Brett, how much does a mail-order bride cost?" She laughed. "Tell him I said, ask Ernie." I told him and his dark eyes teared up. "Brett, what happened to you?" he asked. "She doesn't remember, but we are trying to figure it out," I said. "Tell him Maggie still visits him. I've seen her around him. She's got a little girl she calls Bumblebee with her." I told him and he burst into tears. When he could finally speak, his voice was a gasp. "There's not a soul alive who knows that. Bumblebee was our daughter. She died back in 1974. I've never talked about her since." "Jason, the train," she said, and I told Abe we had to go. "Godspeed, son," he said. When we got on the train, the girl was already there. The bald man got on the same stop he had previously. His attention was once again fixed on her, but hers was once again fixed on her phone. I had no weapon, and this guy was twice my size, but when I thought about him hurting Brett, or this stranger, I think I could have taken him down with pure adrenaline. We were about to find out anyway, because this time when she stood, he stood too. It was still early, not a lot of folks out yet. We followed him, following her, trying to stay ducked out of sight. She paused outside a storefront and fumbled in her purse for her keys. That was the distraction he was waiting on. He charged her like a bull. It was terrifying how quickly he seized her and dragged her into an alleyway. I ran blindly into the alley behind them. He had her pinned against the wall, his meaty hand around her throat. "Hey!" I screamed. "Hey, let her go!" She still had her keys in her hand. While he gaped at me, she swung at his head with a vicious arc. She missed his eye, but the key dug into his cheek. The girl gave it a savage yank, opening up his face. With a bellow of pure rage, he dropped her and grabbed his ruined cheek. Blood spurted between his fingers, and he ran straight at me. I made a desperate lunge for his legs, but he barreled past me straight into the pathway of a Mako's milk truck. I'd hear the sound of that impact in my head for the rest of my life. A thudding, cracking, squelching sound. But I was glad. He'd never hurt another girl again. Brett was gone. I missed her terribly and hoped every day she'd reappear. I realized that was selfish, and then I just hoped she was at peace. There was no grave to visit, so sometimes I'd gather little bouquets of dandelions and place them at the office or at my apartment. Such happy, hopeful little things. 4 months after the incident with Edward Culpepper, that was his name, I'd followed the story avidly in the papers, I was getting a little overtime, helping Abe go through the stack of delinquent customers. "Looks like we'll be cleaning out units hash 27 and hash 38, he said. "Non-payment of rental fees." He tossed the copies of their agreements on the desk in front of me and I froze. Edward Culpepper's face stared up at me from the photocopy of his driver's license. "Renter of unit hash 27. Abe noticed my face and said, "Jason, are you okay?" "That's him," I said. "That's the guy who killed Brett." I don't know why I didn't think of it before then, her strange fear of that unit. Now it made sense. I told Abe, and that old man moved faster than I did as we grabbed the combination for that lock. It took us a while because the until was completely filled with old furniture and boxes of junk. But towards the back, we found a metal barrel. On the ground beside it lay Brett's army jacket. Abe grabbed my arm. "We are not opening that. We are calling the cops right now. Do you understand me?" I let him pull me outside, because I didn't want to see her like that either. Brett's body was finally laid to rest. With her mother's permission, and notice to the caretaker so he wouldn't try to kill them, Abe and I did some gardening work on her grave that next spring. Yellow dandelions covered it, looking as beautiful and sunny as the girl they memorialized. I think she would be pleased. 5 or 6 years passed. I graduated from college, got a real job, fell in and out of love a couple of times, but I never really stopped thinking of her. Every time I saw a white dandelion, I picked it and made a wish. When I was in the area, I visited her grave and made sure she still had her cheery little offerings. One day, I was riding my motorcycle up near Nashville, enjoying a sunny summer day. I guess the driver of the Camaro didn't see me when he swerved around a semi to change lanes. I flew through the air and fell back down, hitting the ground with a bone-jarring thud. I lay there, conscious of sounds and light, but I couldn't move at all. I couldn't feel anything either, except for the heat of the sun on my face. I was disoriented, but I guessed I was in the median. Lying on grass for sure, because there was a round white dandelion inches from my nose. Blackness seeped at the edges of my peripheral vision. I couldn't blow on it, but I made a wish anyway, then passed out. When I came to, I still couldn't move, but I felt a little more. Specifically, I felt someone nudging my side. I looked up to see Brett prodding me with the toe of her boot. "You gonna lie there all day?" she asked and extended her hand. Surprisingly, My hand rose to grab hers and didn't pass through. She felt solid, real. I wondered if I was in the hospital and this was some anesthesia-induced delirium. But the sun felt real enough. I even smelled burned rubber. I let her help me up and I stood there for a moment swaying. I saw my bike some yards away, crushed. "Ugh," I said. "Maybe I shouldn't move too much before the paramedics get here." She winced. "Yeah, about that." She pointed to the ground beside me. It was surreal to see my broken body lying there, staring sightlessly up at the sky. "Oh," I said. "Ouch." She shook her head. "I told you those things would kill you." "So now what?" I asked. "Is there a bright light we walk towards or what?" "You're so calm. I like that about you." She shrugged. "If there's something we're supposed to be walking toward, I haven't found it yet. Maybe it's just me and you." "Maybe it's my wish," I said, and she raised an eyebrow. "I made a wish right before I passed out, died, whatever." She scrunched up her nose. "Oh yeah, is that why I'm here? What was the wish?" "Just one I've wished 1,000 times now. You're really bad about responding to your ghost messages." I took her hands and made her face me. "Sorry, still getting the hang of this business." She waved her hand dismissively. "Such a rookie. But tell me, what was your wish?" "What I always wished that I could see you again someday and do this," I said, and kissed her. I'm not sure how long we stood like that, kissing and holding each other while sirens screamed and traffic whizzed by on the other side of the median. Eventually we started walking. I didn't know where we were going, didn't care. All I knew was that I was with her. "So," I said, "who's Ernie and what's this about a mail-order bride?" Before she could tell me, a terrible cramp seized my body and I felt myself being tugged backwards. Brett frowned, her green eyes suddenly sad. "It's not your time," she said. "Stop fighting it." I didn't want to let go. I wanted to stay with her. But the tugging became a vacuum until I had no choice. I went hurtling backwards. I blinked and saw an ambulance worker standing over me. "There you are," he said, as he popped up the stretcher I was somehow on. They loaded me onto the helicopter. I saw Brett standing over his shoulder. She held a dandelion in her hand. "It's okay, Jason," she said. "Some things are worth waiting for." Then she blew on the dandelion, making a wish.